as Alex said, you will be able to see some of my slides and also the next coming slides. So the prediction will be 100%. That's great. I mean, I will try to start it and see what happens.
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly introduce everything. Thank you. Welcome everyone to 106th Running Online Sport Economics Seminar. Great to see so many faces, some new faces. This is, I guess, notionally the last session of our spring summer series of talks, the Roses seminars. We're delighted that we have Rasmus Storm and Klaus Nielsen presenting on limits to softness in the budget constraint of professional team sports clubs. I'm in the process of putting together the autumn series of talks, and we have a talk scheduled for next week. But it's worth saying that that's a talk tentatively scheduled for next week, because as I'm sure you're all aware from checking your news, we've had a constitutional change here in the UK, and it's possible, we don't yet know when the funeral date will be for the Queen, and that will possibly be, well, schools will close, which kind of dictates that any of us that have kids will struggle to work on whatever day that is, if it's a weekday. So it might be that next Friday we don't have a Roses seminar, depending on the state funeral for the Queen here in the UK. But I will share information. I've already shared what notionally will be next week's talk on Twitter. And we've got a schedule that's emerging for the coming autumn or fall, depending on your parlance. But I don't want to stop Rasmus and Klaus any longer. What they will do, they each have a part of the presentation. They'll present, and they will then take questions at the end. And so please do part your questions and then raise your hand at the end, and we can have lots of discussion based on their fascinating looking work on the limits to softness in the budget constraint of professional team sports. All yours, Rasmus.
Thank you, James, and thank you for having us here. It's a great honor, and we love to talk about this work. Of course, we have been looking at this for the last 10 years or so. So it's very interesting, and also interesting to try to develop this approach and try to test its limits. Basically, it's going to be more of a theoretical exercise today. And hopefully the slides are not too small for you. But this is our presentation index today. I will talk a bit about why the soft body constraint in the first place. What can we use it for? What is it all about? And then Klaus, he will come in with some, more how have we tried to develop this? He will give some case examples. He will go through a very big case example, I believe, and also touch upon the critique and the limitations. How far can we take this soft body constraint approach? And of course, also, look into the future research perspectives that would pop up. And we welcome all to take part in the discussion, because I mean, there are some limitations. We do believe that this perspective holds some explanatory power, but of course, we can look at the black angles to this theoretical approach and maybe try to develop it, and the dialogue can push the research frontier ahead. We believe that's very fruitful. What is it all about, the soft body constraint approach in the first place? Well, it's not that it can explain anything that goes on within professional team sports in Europe. Of course, I think that we can say that in Europe, professional team sports clubs, and now I'm talking mainly about soccer, appear to be characterized by two paradoxes. You could call it some kind of double paradox, I think. First of all, we see this revenue growth that we have seen over the years, which is on my next slide here. I'm not going deep into this. I know that you all are very familiar with these issues. Significant revenue growth in European professional football, not only in the major leagues, but also in the minor. I have a Danish example that I will put up in a second. But also at the same time, there is an absence of profitability or significant deficits. We have also seen that evidenced in many reports and also in the sports economics literature. This is just an example here from one of the UEFA licensing reports. Over the years, there have been aggregate significant cost overruns and deficits, except from around the financial fair play introduction, I know this is debatable, and I'm sure we will have a discussion of these issues later, but some would argue that the financial fair play actually has helped hardening the budget constraints of professional team sport clubs in football in Europe. Of course, we have the COVID-19 at the right side of the picture, where there are significant deficits. That's an external shock to the football economy, so to speak. So that's a different story. Maybe we can take that later. But the overall picture is this first paradox of growing revenues and deficits, or you could call it absence of profitability. I have taken just very briefly an example. I dig down into the financial reports and annual reports of the Danish league. It's a minor league, this one, of course, Danish league soccer, and we see some of the same tendencies with growing revenues and deficits. If you go deeper down into the data here, you will see that it is one or two clubs that actually draws up so that how do you explain that? So that the deficits are not that big. But this history in Denmark, at least also in professional team handball, which is the second most commercialized sport in Denmark, we see the same tendencies more or less with increasing revenues. This is in Danish kroner, by the way, including transfer income. Of course, we have the credit crunch crisis 2008 and 2009, but then again, it stabilizes revenues. We do see at larger deficits around the credit crunch crisis, but this is the general picture for, you could say, European, as we see in other European leagues, in the big leagues in Italy, France, Premier League, and stuff like that. I will just, sorry, I jumped through my slides, but it's not just in order to say that the other paradox is the absence of profitability and coexisting with deficits. That would, from a theoretical perspective, be difficult to understand because, I mean, if there is no profitability in capitalist economies, how can clubs or enterprises survive? And this is where the soft body constraint comes in. It has been developed to understand shortage, for example, in socialist and post-socialist economies, but we believe at least that it holds some explanatory power to understand the high survival of these clubs. It's not that some fold. We will have an example of that later. It's not that clubs fold, they do, but on a general level, there is quite a high survival rate of these clubs, even though they run into financial trouble from time to time. So I see, how can we, the interest here, just to repeat that, has been to how can we explain these paradoxes from a theoretical perspective? How do we understand these phenomena that we see in European professional football? And of course, where does this approach fail? Where do we need to develop it? Yeah, so I will jump to this slide and say, well, it's quite obvious, and I know many in the audience today will also be familiar with these issues. We can explain the absence of profitability by, I would say, two main elements: the institutional mechanisms of professional European team sports, and also the dominance of win optimization, maximization, utility maximization. And the club survival part, the second paradox of this double paradox I kind of was talking about, can be explained by applying this soft body constraint approach to European professional football, and perhaps also the American context. I will get back to that later. This slide I will not go deep down into as well. I think you are quite familiar with the issues here. These institutional mechanisms has been evidenced in lots of the sports economic literature over the years. You could call them some kind of, we are facing some kind of rat race or some ruining conditions of competition due to these different aspects or factors. For example, the system of promotion relegation, unequal distribution of league revenue, inequalities between the different tiers, and stuff like that. It has been evidenced by many scholars working within the sports economics area. So again, this is just to say we're trying to explain the first paradox, And I took a quote. I put a lot of quotes in my slides. I should not do that. I'm sorry. But I think this quote kind of illustrates the win utility maximization idea quite well, that you're also very aware of what it's about. But this is from a Danish manager. He used to be a manager in a Danish team handball club, Jakob Jørgensen. Now he's a director, head of sales, as far as I remember, in one of the big Danish professional clubs, FC Midtjylland. And he kind of talks about it in that way that, well, if we wanted to make a profit, we should not run for medals. We instead, and this kind of illustrates the win maximization idea, we much rather fight for a battle of life and death and run for medals. So yeah, this is kind of the first part of the equation, so to speak, the first paradox that I was talking about. And this, of course, brings us to the second paradox about the survival and deficits coexistence. Again, of course, there are exemptions from this, but if we look at the tendencies, the overall, I believe it has been quite evident that this is what is one of the characteristics of European professional football. And this is where the soft body constraint comes in to help us understand why is it. This is, again, sorry, a quote from Egon Frank, but I think it's kind of also illustrates that if we want to also understand the second part of these issues, we will have to deploy or to use the soft body constraint approach and apply it to a capitalist economic context. For example, European professional, even though it has been developed for socialist and post-socialist economies, and to understand phenomena within that, we will have to apply to European professional team sports in order to understand what is it that is going on here. So, what is the soft body constraint all about? Well, it's a kind of economic cohesion, I hope I pronounced it right, where proceeds from sales and cost of input are a question of life and death for the firm. This is put up in several of Kanai's works, and of course it is dominant, according to Kanai, in capitalist economies. He contrasts that to the soft body constraints situation, which is described here, which is, again, there are different strengths of softness, you could say. I will get back to that. But it's a state of affairs when economics, so to speak, very shortly, is not a matter of life and death to the firm. And this is what is written in this quote specifically, where differences between proceeds from sales and costs from production are not a matter of life and death. And when the firm or the club or the organization we're talking about can survive, even though its investments entails grave losses. That is, and he used that to understand, shortage, for example, in socialist and post-socialist economies. But there's more to it, of course. Again, I think it's fruitful to contrast the different situations. It's also to understand the dynamics in the body constraint. I will get back to that. But first of all, he has 5 conditions of hardness. He talks about, he put that up in his economics of shortage book, in his socialist system books, in many of his papers. So this is the core of, if we want to divide this, what is the hard-bodied constraint all about? We have added in some of our work the H6 condition, talking about soft accounting. I can get back to that and try to explain it. But first of all, if we're talking about a hard body constraint, the firm would be a price taker for both inputs and outputs. It cannot influence the tax rules. They are based on observable criteria. No exemptions can be made. The firm cannot receive free state grants or other grants to cover expenses or to finance investment. No credit, and this is, of course, not the case today. No organization or club or firm in a capitalist society could survive without access to credit. But it's because he made this, of course, to a certain context, the socialist, post-socialist context. So if we translate that into modern day criteria, so to speak, we are talking about you cannot obtain credit on non-commercial conditions if you can't do that, then your budget constraint would be solved. No external finance, that could also be moderated a bit for today. But again, this is his conditions. And H6, no soft accounting is possible. If all of these conditions of hardness holds, then you will face what you could call hardness, or maybe some kind of extreme hardness. We can get back to that later. So, sorry, I just needed some coffee. So what have we are soft body constraint present in European professional team sports? Yeah, we believe it does. It's there. We can find evidence of that. I have some examples I can get back to later, but we have seen soft administrative pricing, for example, with stadium naming rights handed over at a very valuable price to local professional team sports clubs. We have seen soft taxes in Italy and Spain, for example. We have seen soft subsidies in forms of sponsorships, inflated sponsorships, inflated grants, for example. We have seen soft credit that has not been enforced or has been postponed or rescued or restructured at a very soft in soft ways. Soft investment, the municipal stadium example is another variation of that. And we have also seen soft accounting, where different dubious practices and legislative changes has been implemented and used. For example, valuation of players. I know that can be difficult even under normal circumstances, but the valuation of players, for example, or shifting of accounting principles in order to better the situation of the club, at least on a to make impression management, so to speak, has also been seen in European professional team sports. So this is just some examples that is out there, and Klaus will get. I think Klaus will get through an example where we see softness on close to all these different factors, so to speak. I think it's important to dwell a bit on this issue. It also has to do with the behavioral effects and whether the existence of soft budgets is a problem. I know that's debatable, and it has been debated previously also in these Roses talks, I think. It's important to understand that it's the political and social economic environment that determines the budget constraint, and that if expectations of bailout ex ante if ex ante expectations of bailout or support ex post develops within a certain organization or firm or whatever, then it would potentially have some behavioral effects. For example, if you can expect, and that's one of our points in some of our papers, that if you expect to be bailed out ex post, then you start to or maybe you will start to please the sugar daddy, and it hinders also, that's another very important point here, it hinders the Schumpeterian creative destruction process. So it's if soft budget constraints are imminent in specific environments, it has some kind of welfare economic loss to it, basically. But it's important to understand that soft budget constraints is an environmental condition, and it's because that if we take that in consideration, and this is where we kind of develop or try to develop the perspective a bit, then it might be able to open up for, I know maybe some would say you're far, Rasmus, this is a stretch, but we have tried to develop this into to say how far can we use this theoretical framework also to understand what's going. I will get back to that in a second. Also, not only the European context, but also the American one. And if we start to look at the left side of this continuum, you could call it, between loss and profit, we could open up for a different kind of variations of softness, where different conditions of the age conditions of hardness are relaxed. So we could say that the standard economic model is and this is the one you can see up in the left hand corner that has been proposed by Kesen. We could develop that into a more dynamic one. At least this is what we are trying to do. Open up to say, in the European context, taking this soft body constraint approach into consideration, we could say there can be different degrees of softness, basically. And I would also say, if we look at the right-hand side, on the profit side, there might also be cases, we should not rule out that some clubs, I believe we can find some examples that are at least profit seekers, aim to profit maximize, even under more or less hard environmental conditions. So our point here is that the soft-bodied approach not only opens to understand the survival thing that I started out with, it also adds to a more dynamic understanding of what is going on, because we can take both objectives of the clubs and the environment into consideration, which actually is what determines the reality that we can read from the data or we can analyze. I'm not sure I made myself clear, but we believe that this can help. And maybe if I illustrate it with my last slide before Klaus will continue, this is we made a chapter in Vladimir Andreev's equilibrium book on these issues. Try to say, okay, again, some would say this is a stretch. You're far out. I mean, but if we look at the U.S. leagues and say, okay, can we use the soft body constraint approach to understand the differences between the European and the American context? That might be possible, because what we see looking at this of the phenomenon in the American context, we actually found that there was some kind of inverse softness going on here, because environmental conditions are softened ex ante, not exposed, compared to the I know it's not exactly the same that Kunai talks about, but clubs are price makers in terms of costs in the U.S. Context. They enjoy soft taxation. They enjoy large public subsidies. They enjoy a soft competition because there are exemptions from competition law, and it enables them to produce what you could call super profits. So it kind of ends up in this you could call the matrix of different kinds of combinations of club objectives, and the environmental conditions, or the constraint that these different clubs in the US or in the European context faces. And my suggestion here is that, or we welcome a debate on this. How can we measure that specifically? So that's the idea about it. I hope I make myself more or less clear, and you don't think it's too far out. But so, and now over to Klaus. He will continue about how have we tried to say, okay, how far can we stretch this, and what are the limits to this approach, and also to limits of softness in reality. Yeah, thank you. And I will see if I can stop sharing.
It should be the button up by the leave button, I think. Little box with an X in it. Rasmus.
Yeah, it did not disappear. Did I not put it off? No?
Oh, no, Klaus has got his. Klaus is sharing, looks like. Yeah.
It looks like my sharing stopped. So.
Yeah, Klaus, are you on mute?
Yeah, I just sent you my slides because I experienced problems of sharing them. So I wonder if you could share them, then I can just go from page to page. Yeah.
I'll just have to open them. Oh.
Yeah, great.
Great. So I'll make that full screen.
So is there a way that I can go from one slide to the other? Yeah, there are. Okay, I'm fine now.
No, I think I can.
No, I can probably do it. Yeah, but I'll let you know if I have problems here. But anyway,
Okay.
Thank you for inviting us. I was just recently aware of your online seminars, and I had a look at some of the previous ones, and indeed it seems very interesting and relevant, and I will be happy to be part of it in the future. Yeah, so what I'm going to say in continuation of what Rasmus have just said here is that I will concentrate on what you can call one of the new research pathways within this soft budget constraint approach here. And I'll just start by outlining what I think might be needed here. And first, we need more case studies, evidence of soft budget constraints and we call this in the book professional team sport clubs, not only football clubs, but other team sports as well. We need to apply this approach to new empirical context. It's mainly in football. It's mainly in the big five leagues. So we need to expand it country-wise and expand it in terms of sports. Then the mechanisms of softness. There are normally where there are these 6 types of softness. I'll actually add a couple of one in extra in this presentation here, but a more kind of forensic and detailed definition of how these mechanisms actually work. And then what are the societal mechanisms behind this soft budget constraint? What are the emotional, the attachment, the local identity coupled to support of team sport clubs in a locality? How are they also varying between localities and so on? Then varying different identifying varying degrees of softness in different contexts, and you could say the theoretical development to understand this better here. And then there's a lot of case studies, but there are very few kind of proper empirical tests, classical testing of hypothesis. Then what we need to do also is engaging with some of the critiques of, or with the critiques of this approach. This will strengthen the argument, and then identifying the limits of softness, which is the main topic of what I'm doing here. But you can see in this slide here, I have in brackets after these points I said identified some chapters. So luckily, I would say the book here have contributions to each of those here. Let's say, for instance, in identifying varying degrees of softness in different contexts, there's a study of a very detailed study of French football that identifies soft budget constraint, but in varying degrees in different types of clubs. There are empirical tests. Stefan, which I can see is present here, which is great, has a proper empirical test in his chapter here, and so that is just a kind of brief presentation of what the book contains. And I will, if you could get this next slide here, I can see I have problems. Yeah, then this is of course can be seen as some kind of promotion of the book, and indeed it is to some extent, but it's also to kind of say to what extent we have engaged in this kind of developing new or going through new pathways here. So these are the different chapters, and I'll just very briefly go through the first or chapter 2 to 7, and then what I'm saying the rest and the main part of it is chapter 8, which is about limits of softness of professional team sport clubs. So next slide, please. Yeah, so chapter 2 here is a more theoretical chapter. It's about trying to combine institutional theory, especially the concept of institutional logics, and to integrate this in the understanding of soft budget constraint. So it's in a way you can see a theoretical kind of framing of what is often seen as a combination of the sporting logic and an economic logic here. So, and they identify various institutional pressures on management, on clubs, and use these kind of concepts from institutional theory, coercive, normative, and mimetic, and pressures. And you could say that even if they don't kind of conceptualized in that way, it could be seen as a way of modifying a pure economic rationality, in that you are influenced by various normative, mimetic, or coercive pressures in order to, in a way that modifies a more kind of pure economic rationality on from the actors or in this field here. So next slide, please. So then there is a pretty large chapter here by Vladimir Andreev, and it's a very thorough account of why it's difficult to harden budget constraints, and he distinguished between micro, meso, and macro levels of governance. A very forensic article on that kind of explains why even if you attempt to do it, if you want to harden budget constraints, why it's very hard to do so. New slides, please. So then there's the chapter by two French authors here about budget constraints in French football, and they provide a very detailed empirical test of the existence of soft budget constraint and to the degree to which it exists in various contexts and various clubs, and it covers the top 3 tiers in French football. And so very briefly about the results, they show evidence of soft budget constraints, clear evidence here, but also huge varieties. And the conclusion is there are most soft budget constraint in the biggest clubs, while in a majority of these clubs, the budget constraints are pretty hard. So next slide, please. So then we have 2 very original chapters here, 5 and 6, that applies this approach to Central and Eastern Europe. So there are both in chapter 5 and 6 very original evidence from Central and Eastern Europe. And the first of these chapters here is a comparison of Hungary and Poland. And this comparison shows that there are more soft budget constraint in Hungary because, and this is explained by the fact that the socialist heritage is still prominent in Hungary, and some of the same kind of mechanisms that created soft budget constraints in Hungarian football under socialism actually still exist to some extent in Hungary. But another thing of this article here is a contribution is very interesting. It's an empirical test about the soft budget constraints as a mental issue, as a behavioral kind of characteristic. So a high number of managers or directors are being asked what they think would happen if they run into problems, what had happened in the past, and so on. And you could say that there is a clear evidence here that managers think in a sort of budget constrained way. They believe they would be rescued. They believe that the rescuers will mainly be new owners, and they have evidence of this in the past. So next slide, please. So, and this is another one article about Eastern Europe. It's a far more, covers, I think it's 10 countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It's a comparative overview of structures, financing, and existing of soft budget constraint in those countries. So 5 and 6 together kind of applies this here to a new kind of region in compared to what has recently been studied. So next slide. So this is Stefan's chapter, and sorry, Stefan, if I do not present what you mean in a thorough way, but I'll try. So so this is our an engagement with a critique. I think it's fair to say that Stefan doesn't believe that this approach here adds much, and it says that football clubs in capitalist countries are very different from those state-owned enterprises in socialism, where the theory was originally developed to cover. So what Stefan does here is an empirical test. He looks at insolvencies in English football, and he has data from 45 out of the, in total, 67 insolvencies in the period covered here. And the empirical test is, what are the impact on insolvencies on directors and managers of clubs? So and the findings here are that company directors have not higher than, have about a 33% probability of keeping their job. So I got that wrong. It's the probability of keeping the job is 33, and you can argue it's less than this because of those insolvencies which are not covered by this might have a even lower probability. So there is a third of the company managers, company directors actually survive an insolvency. So it's about, or even less than 2/3 of company directors lose their job in an insolvency, and about managers it's about half. So because of this very high probability of losing their jobs, then directors and managers cannot rely on being rescued, and this is what was assumed by in the soft budget constraint theory about managers in state-owned enterprises, that they could rely on being rescued, and this influenced their behavior. And if directors and managers in football clubs, capitalist football clubs, cannot rely on being rescued, then the behavioral assumptions of the theory is not in place. We have some counter arguments for this. I'll not come with this at the moment. We might have a discussion with this, but some of them will appear in the way the rest in the rest of the presentation here. So next slide, please. So this is the chapter which I will talk about in the rest of this presentation here. So the idea is that, yeah, there are indeed, as Stefan have of course pointed out, that there are, in capitalist economies, there are limits to softness. It's different from socialist economies where, well, there are very deep pockets, or even unlimited possibilities of drawing on state funding here. That is not the case in principle in capitalist economies, partly because of constitutional limitations to state power, and also to limits to how much softening can be done by tax financed, and there are of course also democratic decision making in general that limits these rescue activities here. But still, so there are, and there are indeed many examples of insolvencies and even a few liquidations in European football, mainly in the lower league clubs. So, and there are also this in professional team sports. So there are limits to softness, but where are they? If we believe there are soft budget constraint, but in some instances, of course, this is not enough. The softness is not soft enough. So next slide, please. So what we do here in this chapter here is first an overview of failed football clubs in the Big Five leagues, and we add some data from Scotland and Denmark. And so these are examples where the clubs are not too big to fail. And in this chapter, we focus mainly on top tier, but indeed the problem of insolvencies is far greater far more predominant in the lower leagues. And that is an overview. And but then the main part of this chapter are two case studies. One is a well-known case of Glasgow Rangers, and the second is a case which is almost as different as it can be in some respects, but also have similar to Glasgow Rangers in other respects, which is a Danish team handball club called j.j.reade. So, we'll use these kind of data in order to conclude when are budget constraints not soft enough. So next slide, please. So just a brief overview of the three of the Big Five leagues here, and including Scotland and Denmark, with some of the cases here. In England, there were 62 cases of insolvencies in this period here, about 30 years, but only one subdivision case. And Portsmouth FC was a case with very large persistent deficits, and also, and I mentioned this because it's part of the conclusion, a kind of dubious transfer of ownership. In this case, it was to a Russian entrepreneur who was later being charged with asset stripping in another context. So this is not a unique case of transfer of ownership to in periods of trouble to relatively dubious owners in spite of the procedures of fit and proper ownerships. Then we have a case recently in the UK or in England, Bury Football Club, which is a very rare case of full liquidation of a club. It's still not totally clear, but what happened was and there's some of the two of the causes which I also returned to in the general conclusion. They suddenly lost a lot of income because of a collapsed TV deal, and then maybe also a reason here that Bury is in the Manchester area with a very high density of clubs. It means that it has only a very small dedicated catchment area or market size. New slide, please. And then Italy, very different from UK or from Britain here, that there are many bankruptcies, but only here also in the lower leagues. But there are some examples from the top leagues more than in UK. So Parma is a prominent case where the parent company of the owner collapsed and drew Parma with it in its fall, Fiorentina, which went into these kind of administration and these insolvency procedures, but was restructured, but treated with extreme velvet gloves by the league. They were basically allowed to continue with just a new name. Then Perugia, which is different, what was for a long term, for some years, about a decade, in the top of Italian football, but and was owned by an eccentric businessman with also some kind of pretty dubious business transactions, and this was at least part of the reason for the why it failed. In Italy, you could say they are often bordering or are beyond what is seen as legal, and there are many. The involvement here of agents who are engaged in more fraudulent or suspicious or activities of suspicion on a suspicion of fraud is not uncommon. And in Italy, different from UK, government is often involved. There are limits to this because of the EU competition rules, and it's less prominent than it was, but still it's a difference. New slide. So the last of the big five countries, Spain, here is a country where you can say these self-budget constraints are probably most prominent here. The total debt in the league is enormous here. I got the figures from 2012 of 3 billion pounds, and many clubs are constantly on the brink, partly because of the lack of solidarity in Spanish football. There are no sharing of television money here. Then there is a special case of FC Barcelona here. Then just 2 years ago, there are annual deficits, and it's not a debt here. Its annual deficit was 100 million euro. So, and you probably know the current situation, and well, Barcelona still are obviously able to attract and pay for star players of excessive wages in spite of this. Yeah, there are a lot of government subsidies, beneficial tax arrangement, and one example here, in 2020 there was a $500 million bailout where, let's say, the governments convince banks to open credit lines in the total value of that amount here. Tax authorities in Spain are generally less prone to trigger insolvency proceedings than it happens in UK, for instance. Many cases of administration insolvency, including the top tier. Latest example, Malaga Football Club, who made a fire sale of all players in year 2000. Honestly, I don't know what happened since then, and it could be that the situation is different. Next slide is about Scotland here. More examples of top-tier clubs entering administration in Scotland than in England. The examples here: Livingston, Hearts, and Dunfermline. There are in addition to this, there are of course many examples in the lower leagues, but still, in terms of liquidations, there are only 3 cases in the last 50 years. But then, of course, there are Rangers, which I'll come back to. One interesting example here, Gretna Football Club, which were a locality with 3,000 and a population of 3,000 people, who were able to get to the top of Scottish football in a few years. Also even entered European competitions, but then the extraordinary generous owner withdrew support and actually died, and then the club totally collapsed. So this shows the vulnerability of success based on an extraordinary generous owner. So next slide, or the last slide, about these case overview. So Denmark say there are 7 cases of bankruptcies in the top 3 tiers in the last 20 years. In most cases, it's actually where mergers have gone wrong, where the mergers are not able to, the new merge club are not able to transfer the loyalty and enthusiasm and the emotions attached to the mother clubs to the new merger. So there are several examples of this in Denmark. Then there is a club called Frem, where there's a clear disconnect between sporting ambitions and, on the other hand, a crowded and poor catchment area in a Copenhagen suburb, and then a substandard stadium. And this disconnect has meant that the club have been in administration procedures a couple of times in the last 20 years. And the most interesting example is Lyngby, which is twice Danish champion, 3 times winner. So it's one of the potentially biggest clubs that were in the 2000s went bankrupt and were restructured and were relegated to the 4th tier. So why did this happen of a very successful sporting, very successful club? Part of it was location. It's in a suburb of Copenhagen where, well, it's mainly pensioners and well-off people. It had not been able to upgrade the stadium, and so the backing of the club is relatively limited, and not that the fans are not very enthusiastic, but there are not too many of them because of the location. And then when this happened here, the insolvency, then there was a lot of suspicion of fraud among the new owner came up, which made the local authority reluctant to support it. So next slide, please. So in Europe and elsewhere, you could say there are differences between insolvency procedures. And in Europe, there are very, very rare cases where clubs cease to exist. There are a few examples, Waregem in Belgium and FC Amsterdam in Netherlands. But it's more common in countries where without a long footballing history. Here are some examples of top clubs who have folded just years or after being national champions: Los Angeles Aztecs, Dalian Shide, and Jiangxi Football Club. So in countries where they don't have this kind of entrenched fan culture and long history, then there's a much more clear kind of economic logic of owners, which may mean they simply close the club just years after a huge sporting success. Next slide, please. So, Glasgow Rangers, you might, it's a well-known case, so I won't go much into detail, but a little bit is necessary here. So why is this an interesting case? It's because it should be characterized by unique softness. Apart from Barcelona, maybe it's very difficult to find clubs where there are so much emotional attachment to a club, and because it's here in just like in the Catalonian Barcelona club, it's linked to strongly entrenched religious, political, and social identities. So you hardly find a more pure case of this anywhere. So, and also you can say it was extremely successful in terms of sporting success. Actually, Rangers is the club who has won most national championships at the world level, and has also had some kind of international success. But still, it entered into insolvency proceedings in February 10 years ago, and was liquidated the same year. And a Phoenix club were relegated to the 4th tier. So how could this happen? It's almost an unthinkable case, but there must be some aspects that made it happen even so. So next slide, please. So how was the past administration here? So you would say it started in the late 80s, where a new owner, Maury, bought the club, and he implemented a very radical change in club strategy. So it was borrow for success by means of acquisition of expensive star players. And you could say one of the consequences in the 6 years in the beginning of the 90s, Rangers had higher transfer spending than any club in England. And that is, of course, crucial, because there are, of course, far more funds, sponsorship, television money, anything in English football. But still, Rangers was the club who has the highest spending in the UK here. You could not say this very bad business strategy at the time, because with the explosion of the media field here, and then there was an obvious kind of a rationale for borrowing for success. But international success did not happen. Overspending continued, and huge debt accumulated. Well, how was that possible? It had very generous lenders. There was a kind of, you could say, huge social capital, economy relationships, the bank directors in the Bank of Scotland who accepted very some kind of lending that was not very commercial, should say the least. From 1996, they started to feel the heat. So there were several attempts to raise additional capital. Bank debt was restructured. There was a lot of cases of soft accounting. And why is this important? Is because it disguises actual insolvency, fend off creditors, fool business partners, fans, media, and the general public. So a lot of cases where the same kind of property was valued in different ways, depending on whether it was important to make it large or important to have it small. So it was incredibly flexible accounting here. Next slide, please. Then there was open non-payment of taxes or delay in payment of taxes. A lot of it, but then there was some kind of hidden non-payment of taxing as well, which in the end proved to be its undoing. There was a scheme called discounted option scheme, for two players were bought, where they had some offshore funds where they could kind of deduct the dividends from this in their taxes, and it accounted to a tax liability of £2.5 million and was recognized by the club as something they should pay when it was discovered. And but then there was a more dubious one, the employment benefit trust scheme, where it's an enormous amount at that time of tax liability. And this was a scheme where clubs got part of their salary in the form of loan, and it was organized in such a way that they should never repay the loan. The problem with this from the club was that, well, the players were not quite, for understandably, very happy with a informal promise of not having to repay the loan. So they insisted on a formal letters explaining that was the case. So there were side letters which were hidden from the tax authorities, where the club kind of accepted that they were actually not going to repay these loans, even if it. So in a sense, it was kind of a hidden wage. So this was, in a sense, this was illegal tax avoidance to use the scheme, but it was not legal to use side letters. This had not been a problem unless there was in 2007 a raid by the City of London police, where they were looking for something else but found those side letters, and that changed the situation quite a lot. Then HBOS was taken over by Lloyd's here under the financial crisis, which meant that just as suddenly this kind of very valuable social capital built over time with the networking with the bank directors disappeared with a stroke. Yeah, so sorry, I was wrong I was too quick here. In May, it's not in May 2001, it was in May 2011. Then a new owner bought the club for a total amount of £1, and he promised to repay bank debts and to repay the tax liabilities. He kind of repaid the bank deficits by borrowing the money in a way from a company called Ticketos, where he gave them security or collateral in future season tickets. But he did not pay the tax liabilities, and he stopped to pay all general taxes here. So you could say, was this a fit and proper owner? There were a lot of things in the past of Craig White, as he was called, that could indicate that he was not a fit and proper owner, but he was allowed to do this. But in February 2012, Rangers entered into administration. Next slide, please. So what happened here with the insolvency procedures was that the tax authorities put their feet down. They did not accept the proposed a voluntary agreement among the creditors, and they did so partly because they had lost trust in the club, because it's tax evasion, tax avoidance, it's fraudulent behavior, and partly because they want to deter other clubs from entering into this kind of huge debt situation as Rangers was. You could say it was easier for the tax authorities to do so from London than if, let's say, if there has been the tax authorities was in Edinburgh. They were not under the same kind of pressure. Yeah. But in the case here, you could say there are evidence of all 6 forms of softness. Limits to soft taxation seem to be the undoing in the end. There were additional forms of softness in the process of administration and in the process of liquidation as well. I can come back to details a bit about this if necessary. What was the role of the fans and media here? The fans and the did not accept the situation. They wanted the club to go on, and they actually acted in a, well, they intimidated the administrators and liquidators and so on, and there was a lot of very problematic thing going on in their sense. The media were on the side of the club. It was mainly some of the social media who actually pointed out some of the problems. The more general media was uncritical on the side of Rangers against the administrators and liquidators. What happened was now there was liquidated a new legal entity with a name which you can only distinguish from the previous name by paying extreme attention. So the Sporting Aftermath was here. It was relegated to 4th tier. What happened there was kind of remarkable, because all the clubs in the Premier League, all the clubs in the football leagues, and there's a 2nd tier, 3rd, had an interest in admitting Rangers, a clear economic interest, because a lot of their revenue were dependent on matches with Rangers. But they chose to follow the pure sporting logic and said Rangers should follow the rules and be relegated as far as possible. Next slide, please. So then briefly about this Danish case of a handball club here. They resemble Rangers in the sense that they went bankrupt almost at the same time, 2010, and was, like Rangers, demoted to several tiers. And like Rangers, it very quickly recovered under only a new legal identities, and they returned to the top tier within a few years. And actually, last year they became Danish champions again. So apart from this, these clubs are as different as you could imagine. Glasgow is a city of about more than 1.5 million inhabitants. In this Gudme, where these localities where the handball club is, has a population of 3,000. There are about the attendance of home matches is about 2,000. In Rangers, it's about 50-60,000. And also the depth that kind of fell the club was at very different levels here. But you could say this is a textbook case of a club which is the rallying point of a small society. It was basically the lifeblood of this society. It's close to some educational establishment where it draws a lot of its players, and it's enormously good at talent development, and was able to also have success at European level in spite of this kind of very small catchment area. Next slide, please. So the past administration here, it's in around 2000, it was a well-driven, balanced club. Then it bought the arena from the local municipality, which meant that it had different legal entities, and that played a role in what was later several cases of soft accounting, where they could kind of present should shift different accounting, shift the accounting from different entities here. So then came a period where they had to fend off new money-strong competitors in the market. They tried to broaden the catchment areas with limited success. Enormous, just like Rangers, they have many examples of extremely flexible and soft accounting, where you could say within a few years, kind of the value of the arena could be a fraction of what it was, and then a few years later be several times bigger. So that is an example here of in soft accounting, just like Rangers. They had a spending freeze, acquisition of some star players here, that meant that they ran into debt. But what really mattered here was the credit crunch. And it meant that some of their main sponsors collapsed. They could not get main ones. The banks tightened the terms of their overdraft facility. And then there was soft taxation. The local authorities accepted the payments, but still it was not enough. There was soft regulation in the sense they got dispensation in relation to the kind of annual financial statements and so on. They tried with pay cuts, and in the end, this didn't succeed because some of the star players didn't accept it. And some of the star players, after having this experience with the club, kind of have publicly said that they believe that the club deliberately chose administration instead of going on in this kind of impossible situation. And referring to what Stefan talked about and or wrote about in his contribution here, what was the impact of the board membership? There was none. The board was the number of members of the board were decreased, but all members of the new board were also members of the previous board. So no kind of impacts there on the managers and the board. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think I'll briefly say this is more a kind of related to this. Is administration the end, or is it a new beginning? So normally you could say there is insolvency, administration, restructuring, a company voluntary agreement, and then possibly liquidation. But soft body constraint is not necessarily the proof of soft body constraints is not about insolvency. Softness is mainly before insolvency, something to prevent insolvency happening. But when insolvency happened, when there is insolvency, then soft body constraint can also happen in the sense that no creditor are willing or interested in triggering administration, or a new funding or credit will appear. And then it can also happen in terms of administrators who are pressurized by the environment and who are sympathetic to the club, who make favors to the club in the process, as happened in the case of Rangers. So you could say that in some cases, the club uses the administration process to clear its debts, leaving behind the creditors receiving only a small share of their claims. Then, of course, there are sporting penalties and regulations by the football leagues that meant that this discourage and diminish soft body constraint. The football credit rule have the opposite effect, because this means that there are little left for other creditors, so their interest in administration will be limited. So they would hold off. It's maybe not the case for tax authorities, but for other creditors. So administration almost always ends with an agreement and writing down of debts. Only in very seldom cases there's a liquidation, but in those cases, the Phoenix clubs typically take over club property, stadium and training grounds, because at a very low price, because there are very limited alternative demand. Next slide. So why do owners and creditors do so? Why do they act so irrationally? So you could say it's partly because the sporting logic modifies economic rationality. It could be because this enormous fan and community pressure and the emotional attachment to the club. It could be because of credit, for the terms of the creditors, and I distinguish here between creditors and owners. So they receive prestige and goodwill by loaning, or or at least they lose prestige and goodwill if they pull the plug on a club. What about owners? They may have motives different from profits of the club. Here, it could be because they own a club mainly because it's consumption. They simply like it. It's not an investment in a vehicle for profit. It's consumption, and in many cases, it's conspicuous consumption. It's something where they like to do because they are, in a sense, boasting about being a member of the football club. They get goodwill, prestige. It's maybe easier to get other loans and so on for their other business, and it's generally a vehicle for higher profits in other lines of business. And then the last one, some owners are doing it because of sports washing. It's not because they want to earn money. It's because of other purposes. So I think last slide now, or the second last. So my conclusion here, when are soft body constraints not soft enough? We can see in all these cases there are evidence of all 6 forms of softness. There are also, and these are 3 new forms, or I'm not sure, I will in these cases at least you could argue that, or hypothesis that this also exists, soft regulation, when a club is allowed not to make a financial statement or things like this. You could say that is soft regulation. Soft insolvency procedures, where the administrative give favors to the clubs, as the administrative Rangers did. Soft liquidation process, where the liquidators do what they can in order to give a good start for a Phoenix club. Then the cause of collapse is hardly insolvency in itself, but rather too much accumulated debt. But when is it then too much? It depends on the status of the club, its support, the preferences, creditors, the way it perceives their situation, and the structure of the debt. And most important here, it seems that it's when the tax authorities lose patience, that's what triggers the process. It's most of the cases, this is the case. Then there are disincentives for other creditors, as I just said. So the very last slide here. So another things which are kind of can catch up from these cases here, that in many of these cases there are fraudulent or semi-fraudulent or suspicions of fraudulent behavior by clubs or owners. And there are cases where soft loans suddenly become hard loans, as happened in the case of Rangers, where with the when HBOS was being taken over by Lloyds. There are cases where new owners cannot be found, or at least not new proper owners, where more kind of eccentric chances take over the clubs, and they are not, and the fit and proper ownership rule regulations are not strong enough to hinder this. When a generous, very generous owner withdraws the support, then that can fail a club. When an owner's other businesses collapse, that can pull the club with it in this fall. Then the financial crisis, as in 2008 and onwards, then there can be fallouts in terms of loss of the sponsors, the restriction of credits. It could be the players failing to accept pay cuts. It can be the market size is too small, and it can be that there is an absence of an entrenched football culture. Sorry for me going beyond what I was allocated of time, but that's the last word.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Rasmus. We've got some time for questions and comments now, and so I'll invite folk to raise their hands. What I will do just quickly is I will, I guess, it's kind of a clarification, I guess, on your Bury FC point. I think possibly the eccentric owner might be the better description of what happened with Bury, because they had a particular owner who, yeah, it appears to have driven them into the ground, and the impact of the television deal, I think, was much earlier. It led to quite a few insolvencies that I think Stefan's looked at in his work. And Bury, it appears that they had an eccentric owner who, I guess, lost interest, having spent quite a lot of money, left them with lots of liabilities. But I suspect it kind of fits the eccentric owner rather than necessarily the television deal. There is obviously a lot of teams in the Greater Manchester area, but then the footballing pyramid takes care of that. My team has just dropped into the 5th division because there's so much competition in the region, I think it's fair to say. Anyway, Mobilaji has his hand up.
Yes. Afternoon. Thank you so much for the talk. I think I have a few things I just wanted to ask, as well as probably a few comments. The first one is around the slide where I think the one around the English league and what had happened. And I think it was a paper by Stefan Szymanski, and where he mentioned that directors and managers losing jobs, the fact that they can that they lose their jobs, so they cannot rely on being rescued. So I just wanted to find out if when it comes to soft budget constraint, who whether it's the owners, right, that, or who is the actual beneficiary of the soft budget constraint, if, for example, directors are having or not being able to be rescued first and foremost. And I think the other part of that same question is how impactful is the role of football fans in soft budget constraint, because it seems as though they're the ultimate drivers of soft budget constraint. So that's the first question.
Should I answer
Will you do
right
it?
away, or? Yeah.
Yep.
So James, do you want me to answer right away or collecting questions or?
I think just answer right away. I think.
Yeah. No, I'll make it brief here. That or maybe Rasmus, have you something to part of that relate to you?
No, not really, but thank you for the comment. Well, it's interesting what you are saying. I believe that yes, the fans would have something to say here, but also it must be the fan behavior that also is attached to, for example, owners or other people that kinds of develops this environmental condition where softness can be implemented, so to speak. So yeah, a fan identity of different external supporters would be a very good prediction. If there are many of them, the probability of the specific club being rescued or survive would be high. I don't know whether that was that answered your question.
Yeah,
if I understood it correctly. But we the emotional attachments can, and also the thing that people act quite irrational in the sense, that's a kind of fan-like behavior, and I think that is one of the factors behind softness that can institutionalize such an environment where the clubs can survive. So yeah, you're right.
And then the last question is around. So I saw that in the first half of it, you spoke around the Danish league, and I was I think the question around it was, the first few slides you showed how profitability had reduced after the implementation of financial fair play, and then of course because of COVID it kind of went back down. So the question is, and I think that slide you put up is relating to the top 5 leagues in European football. So my question is, have you had a look at the relationship between player trading in terms of profitability between the top 5 leagues and then in quotes smaller leagues, and whether that in itself can actually be a form of soft budget constraint?
That's a good point. No, I haven't. That could be an interesting study to do, actually, I would say. In relation to, and I know why you raised the question about financial fair play. I saw the other Roses talk where you had some good discussions also with Stefan on these issues. So that was interesting, and I liked it very much. I have not looked into whether financial fair play specifically have had an effect, for example, on minor leagues like Denmark, but that would be interesting. The descriptive statistics or the descriptive data I showed, we need to go deeper down to it, because it kind of covers that some of the big clubs actually do turn a profit while many of the others struggle in order to survive. So and this is also why I open up for a dynamic to see that there is a dynamic, different kinds of budget constraints at play also in European leagues. I believe that you could identify some in the minor, in the major European leagues, some clubs that could be called some kind of at least profit seekers and are able, even though they operate under a hard budget constraint, turn a profit. I believe we have some cases in Denmark, at least over a period of time. And it was just to say there are dynamics here, and what we have tried to do is say the soft budget constraint approach, it has some explanatory power for a lot of clubs, but we can find case examples where it does not fit very well. And that is why we try to develop that, matrix I put up in my last slide. I know it was very small, so it's difficult to see, but the idea is to say there are different combinations of club objectives and environmental conditions. That is also why I said, I try to stress that the environmental conditions are very important to take into consideration. So there can be different combinations. Some clubs can aim for a profit maximization. They might fail because the environmental conditions are very hard, and we also have the competition structure, which is very difficult to deal with, that is institutionalized. And there can also be examples of clubs living under very soft conditions that actually turn a profit. This is what we see in the accounting sheets, and the fact that they aim for profits, and they are maybe able to profit maximize, as was my example with the US situation, where conditions are softened ex ante. So again, the point is, it depends on the environmental situation. In one part of the country, in Denmark, for example, we would see some conditions and some club objectives. In another, we would see some others. That was my point in that dynamics and the complexity of this.
Just half a minute addition here. The chapter on France in the book has actually a pretty impressive kind of empirical kind of test of the existence of soft budget constraints in different French clubs, and they identify different types of clubs, where some of them can be seen as having soft and very soft, and some can be seen to have close to very hard budget constraints. So that is the case. In terms of fans, I would say, if you have read about the situation in Glasgow around the administration of Glasgow Rangers here, and look at the fierceness of the fan reaction here, I think it's not difficult to imagine what it would mean for anybody to pull the plug on a club like this. And it's from verbal to almost physical intimidation and so on, that and what is a reputation of a creditor or who will pull the plug. I would argue that if the tax authorities had been in a independent Scotland, Rangers would not have failed. It was because it was in London.
Thanks, Klaus and Rasmus. Stefan has his hand up. Stefan, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
We have nothing to do with it. It's not us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would be happy to.
Yeah, we will. Maybe you should put on a headset. Your microphone might be bust or something. Oh, we don't know.
Okay, well, I guess Stefan's not able to solve.
Maybe we could start to predict what you would be saying.
Well, I guess
I could maybe say that if Stefan cannot say that, then I'll say that. Well, I think he has a very forceful argument here, but I would say about in these contributions to the book that if the behavioral consequences for directors and managers of insolvency is not the same as in the state-owned enterprises in Eastern Europe, then and if they have a clear economic interest in avoiding this, then the behavioral consequences of the situation are widely different. I would say the counter argument here is that well, maybe it's not only economic rationality. Maybe they are circumscribed by institutional framework, by this kind of emotional attachment, the fans, that mean they actually believe that in it, and they act maybe not purely economic rationally because of that. That's one thing. They are pressured from fans and locality in order to act in a different way that they might want to also, and then it could also be that actually I would turn around your argument that the fact that if they are in a very very poor situation, then at least the chance that they will be survived, and they do so in many cases, could make them enter into administration, because that is better than the alternative. So there are other arguments, but these are the main arguments. I'm sorry that Stefan is not able to take this right on, but maybe we can do this in another context.
Yeah, we'll have to perhaps have to organise something different. We have also reached 4 o'clock as well, so perhaps in the interest of finishing on time, maybe it was good that we couldn't hear Stefan, but it's a shame that we couldn't get the discussion, which would surely have been very productive and very interesting. And thank you, Rasmus and Klaus. I think your talk has been very interesting. You've hinted very much at the role that sports clubs, football clubs play in their communities, and that obviously has some kind of complicated relationship with that level of hardness or softness of a budget constraint. So really interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. As I mentioned at the start, we're going to move into our autumn or fall schedule, and next week we do have a talk planned. September the 16th, contingent on there not being a state funeral for Queen Elizabeth II here in the UK. And that will be Anastasia Nebelsina from the New Economic School presenting Hosting Sports Mega Events, the Costs of Ensuring Rotation. So I will leave you all to your weekends, and hope to see you again next Friday. And hopefully we can hear Stefan next Friday as well. See you all soon.